Thank you all for being here, and especially you two, Abigail and Coleman. Now, we have lots to talk about this evening, lots to cover, and I thought the best place to start would be the recent election, because your election was really quite something. Were you surprised by the result? And what are your general feelings about a second Trump term? We'll start with Abigail.
Well, I don't make political predictions. I don't feel like I know who's going to win a particular election. And I was not someone who sort of formed an idea of who is certainly going to win. But if you were following the media, you were surprised because it really did look like it was going to be very, very close and that we wouldn't know for a while. We certainly were not expecting a decisive victory. And what's that going to mean? Well, I'll just say a few things. The cabinet that he is bringing in so far looks like a good one. It does. It looks like a bunch of people who, yes, a lot of them were canceled themselves. Some, like Jade Bhattacharya, for tremendous bravery and standing up to really the bullies who had taken over a lot of our institutions and federal agencies. And without discussing, every pick, in general, it looks like serious people who want to get back to the business of things that we know are better policies, making government more efficient, but also more responsive, and to stop covering up for the lies. And I'm in California, where I deal almost exclusively with liberals. And I will tell you the degree of relief that people feel that they can speak once again, whether they agree or not, is really palpable.
Well, I actually won $50 predicting Trump would win. Though that overstates my confidence. I actually wasn't confident he would. And I wasn't, and I'm not all in on him as a supporter. But essentially what happened is in 2016, the polls underpredicted him because people are afraid to say they like him. In 2020, the polls underpredicted him, even though he lost. The polls still underpredicted him because people were afraid to say they liked him. And many people thought, well, surely the pollsters learned a lesson twice in a row. These are pretty smart people. They're quants. They can absorb lessons. They're not going to make the same mistake 3 times in a row. And that's exactly what happened, right? And the French guy won $80 million on crypto, betting on the simple theory that if you ask people who their neighbors are going to vote for, that actually gives you a much better sense, because people are afraid to tell you that actually they're leaning towards Trump this year, which says a lot about the culture and how little has changed and harkens back to the introductory remarks about the climate in Canada, which I hear is similar on analogous issues. As for Trump himself, I think it's a great opportunity for him to follow through on what is a huge mandate with really wise objectives. Government is too bloated and inefficient, and the economy is messed up. The border is a disaster. So he won. Really, the reason most people voted for him were to sort out some of the biggest issues in our country. Can he follow through? It's really anyone's guess. In his first term, I think he, I view him as somewhat a high risk, high reward candidate. Whereas with Kamala, you would almost certainly get something kind of mediocre to less than mediocre. Trump has because he's so unconventional, he has an ability to get great wins that nobody would have possibly predicted, that no expert would predict, like peace between Israel and 5 Muslim countries, for example. But at the same time, he can be erratic, and he's Trump. So I hope for the best. I hope that at the end of the cabinet process, he has the best people around him. And I think in the best case scenario, he'll do a lot of good.
Right. So Peter Boghossian recently predicted that the woke, whom he calls the enemies of liberty, he predicts that they will retaliate with the ferociousness of a cornered wild animal in the wake of Trump's victory. First of all, do you think he's right? And if so, what will that look like? What obstacles can they put in Trump's way for all of these bold reforms that he's got planned?
Well, I don't think it's right. No, but that doesn't mean there won't be pockets of extreme resistance. And the reason I don't fundamentally think that's right is they've never encountered any resistance. Yeah. Look at our campuses, okay? Just take my own campus once, a while ago now, Columbia, where 40 students hammered their way into Hamilton Hall. They busted through the glass with hammers and did thousands of dollars worth of damage to one of our oldest buildings. Nobody was punished. The student who last year was called before a disciplinary meeting and then posted to Instagram, "You're lucky I'm not out there killing Zionists," he's back on campus. So the woke haven't met with resistance. We haven't been enforcing basic laws in America across the board. So they don't even know what it looks like to find actual resistance, actual punishment, and be handed a loss for the first time. They weren't prepared for it, and they aren't going to be if we start enforcing the laws, which I hope we will. And I'll just give you one more thought about that. You know, they hide behind masks at the protests. That ought to tell you everything about their level of courage. So they stopped Jews from entering buildings, the library, class, these woke kids behind masks. I can think hardly of anything more cowardly than that. So in general, no, I'm not terribly impressed. Now, does that mean, here's where I think Boghossian's right. They are willing to die on this hill. They are radical. So I've interviewed a lot of people in the schools and other places who are absolutely committed to gender ideology. They will teach it. They will get fired for it. They don't care. Yes, they are absolutely diehards for their cause and with a religious fervor. But in general, actually, most Americans are not on their side. And what we had in America was really a false sense that we were divided because the media, to a large extent, painted that picture. But I'm, as someone who has interviewed, thousands of parents across the country, I can tell you when you talk to a parent, you can hardly tell a liberal from a conservative. They talk the same and know they don't want their daughters to be told they're really sons and have that hidden from them. Nobody wants that.
I think there will be less resistance to Trump this time than there was last time. I see maybe 2 or 3 reasons for that. One is that Trump's win this time was so decisive. He won the popular vote, which almost nobody predicted except that very newly wealthy French man. And nobody disputes that he won the popular vote. Right? Nobody disputes that he won, which wasn't true the first time. Every single state in America shifted to the right in the past 4 years. Trump has run 3 times. Each time he's gotten a higher share of the Black and Hispanic vote than the last time. No one predicted that 8 years ago. He got a higher share of the Black vote than any Republican in 50 years. Nobody predicted that. So it's not just the fact that he won, it's how he won. I think takes a lot of the steam out of the hashtag resistance that was highly energized the first time around, not only by the fact that he lost the popular vote and had this crazy upset victory, but also by the fact that almost half the country was convinced that he was installed as Putin's puppet based on completely made up stories. There are no stories like that this time. Everyone accepts left and right that he's legitimate. And so I think that takes a lot of the steam out of the resistance.
That's great. Okay, so now I'm going to go to your personal experiences. You've both faced criticism for challenging dominant narratives. Do you now think that there's any hope that intellectual dissent can thrive? And we still have a really polarized cultural space, but do you think now the illiberal left is starting to lose some of its power, like to censor?
Absolutely. I mean, I've noticed it. I think, many people have asked in the past 2 years, did we reach peak woke? And I think, I think we did. I think wokeness in the censorious kind of illiberal left wokeness really started around 2013, though it has roots much further back, peaked around 2020, 2021, and has receded since then. And you can see it in a million places. You can see it in the fact that, the New York Times can actually publish opinions that are essentially Abigail Shrier, whereas, even 2 years ago they couldn't, and 5 years ago it couldn't even be contemplated, right? So there's a million examples that we can see that a certain taboos are breaking, but we're still going to have this idea set with us for a long time. It's still totally entrenched on the universities. And so it still needs to be fought.
I would just say that it's never going to be easy to say something that's unpopular. And especially, we have so much collusion that's come to light between government and the tech world, so that it was actively, we know, censoring Americans and speech that, articles we couldn't read, books we couldn't get. And it shows how much is invested in that. There's a great deal invested. And I do believe they'll try that again. I don't know which administration, but there will always be that temptation. It's too easy. And a lot of parents reach out to me, they know something very bad is going on in their school, but they don't want to say anything. They definitely don't want to go on the record. Physicians, I dealt with this all the time. Physicians, can you, please leave my name out of it, about medical topics, about gender dysphoria, right? Or girls transitioning, believing they had gender dysphoria. It never gets easy. It never gets to that point where you think, wow, this is nothing. I just told a bunch of trans activists that nothing they've said is true. You sort of have to make a decision. I think the will precedes everything else. You just make a decision one day, and that is, I'm not going to lie. And I'm not going to suborn lies either. And when we get to a place in a society when we're willing to state the truth, then other people will be willing to state the truth. But I do think the decision comes first.
Right. So a lot of the problems we've already talked about, it's entrenched in academia. How do we get it out? How do we get rid of it from the academy?
I think that's going to be very hard. There's a real question as to whether some of the schools are salvageable. And it's a really deep question. As someone, I interviewed extensively professors at Columbia, and I've watched what's happened there. Just to take one example, they had, you have these bureaucracies, of course, the DEI at every university, and they're very, very large. Maybe not every university, majority, certainly every elite university, and they're very, very large and deeply entrenched. So you had a situation at Columbia where the DEI bureaucracy, last year they were meeting, and the anti-Semitism task force was reporting to them on what they had found. Students claiming they'd been kicked out of clubs for being Jewish, barred from access to university, barred from the library from being Jewish, unable to cut through different parts of campus because they were Jews. They were told, you're not allowed. And you have a bunch of administrators sitting around making fun of it. And someone caught it on text. They took a picture and they sent it to a reporter, and it hit the news. And the lower ranked deans were dismissed for embarrassing the university. And the dean who engaged in it is still there. He's not going anywhere. So you don't have universities. They're going to do everything they can to avoid the law, whether it's Title VI or fair admissions v. Harvard, which we know they are rampantly disregarding in admissions. That's the Supreme Court case that said that race-based admissions could no longer be used because it ran afoul of our Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We know that they're not following the law, so it's going to be a question of who has the stronger will, whether this administration does or whether the woke, bureaucrats who run I guess they're not bureaucrats, but the apparatchiks who run the universities are.
I think there's two lessons from the past year and a half. One is that you have to hit them in the pocketbook. I mean, after October 7th, the only thing that really moved the needle at some of the elite universities was threats from donors. For whatever reason, moral suasion, it didn't work for the past 10 years. There's been people, there's been so many people calling out elite universities for a decade and very little change. But when you actually hit them where it hurts, you get their attention. And then secondly, the DEI bureaucracies are not all powerful. They can be, I mean, look what happened at University of Michigan. So University of Michigan, not unique, but special among state universities, went all in on DEI and multiplied its DEI hires by something like 10. They had over 200 DEI officials and made a specific point when Chris Rufo and Robbie Starbuck and others launched a very successful campaign against DEI in the media. They said, no, we're doubling down and tripling down. New York Times did an intensive investigation of what has been the result of that doubling and tripling down. And the result is best described by an old parable I heard from when the British ruled India, which was that they were having a problem with a particular kind of snake. You may have heard this. And so they decided to give a cash reward for every person who brought in a dead snake, thinking that 2 + 2 = 4, all the dead snakes will be gone. Turns out, if you give a cash reward for dead snakes, people will breed snakes and kill them and start snake farms. And it turns out that there were way more snakes at the end of this dumb program than there were at the beginning. That's kind of like what DEI bureaucracies are, right? You think, there's some racial discomfort, there's some microaggressions, there's occasionally some real racism on campus. Let's double our DEI department. They'll fix it. Well, it turns out, no, they just solicit problems that would not have been there otherwise. The thing that, when you might have been a college freshman, it was like an interesting, uncomfortable conversation with your roommate of a different race than you, where you both grew. That now gets reported to a DEI bureaucrat as a microaggression because they asked where you're from, So everything that seems like it's tamping down the problem is actually exacerbating it. And that's what happened at University of Michigan. And they've been forced to admit that really reluctantly because it's become so obvious, even for an organization that doubled and tripled down on its investment in DEI.
So they were forced to admit. Have they dialed it back?
Yeah, I think that they're in the process of that right now.
Very interesting. All right, we've got, so academia is one, media. Let's move on to the media. When Trump being elected, is this the end of maybe it's already happened, but is it officially now the end of the mainstream media in that they have no influence over the election? That they once would be able to sway the vote, that perhaps the New York Times, the Washington Post, they may have actually had some influence in which way the nation voted. Is it now official that they have no Would you say they have no power now?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, the thing to understand about the woke, or whatever we want to call them, these die-hard far leftists, is that they're willing to die on this hill. And what that means when they meet up against a larger, moderate population is that they win. And we're seeing this all over the place. The amount of lying and cheerleading they were willing to do to get their person into office was pretty shocking. And I do believe there's going to be efforts for that again. See, it's not a fad. That's the wrong, my own take is that that's not the wrong way to think about it. It's not something like a pendulum that swings back, right? With gravity. Right? To me, that's the wrong way to think about it. It is absolutely like a religion, and they're completely committed to it. So the idea that it's broken or the spell is over, bell bottoms are out, I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it. When we hand them losses, they will recede as a group and they'll try something else. And I will just tell you, someone who spent a lot of time tracking gender ideology in schools, they are now pushing the pro-Hamas materials in schools with the exact same fervor and the exact same strategy. It's actually the same people doing it too. So they just shapeshift quite happily between Queers for Palestine or, boys and girls sports, whatever it is, they are very happy to keep going. So, I don't think we win by letting up on the pressure. It's over. The media is back to normal. And I'll tell you a really quick story. After Irreversible Damage has been out a year, a friend of mine who worked at one of the legacy media outlets said, listen, we have some reasonable editors. I talked to one of them. She's going to interview you. I've persuaded her to interview you for your book. So she's going to call you. And I thought, I was a little nervous about how this would come out, but I said, okay. So this is one of the top outlets in America. And she called me, and she's a young journalist. And she said to me, she started by saying, of all the things you could have written about the transgender experience, why did you choose this?
I love that question. I love it. I've heard so many versions of that, as if you don't care about the same issue that I care about, but have the opposite opinion on it. It's such a ridiculous point of view. Like either it doesn't matter, in which case, why do you care about it?
That's exactly.
Or it does matter, and I disagree with you.
That's exactly right. And what she was saying, which had been echoed online a lot, was that I was a pervert. I was obsessed with children's bodies. That was my problem. And people who prominently were featured in the New York Times said that about me. The problem was with me. And this journalist was echoing that because that was her belief system. And what I said to her, keeping my voice as measured as I could, but because I was fairly angry, was, well, I'm a journalist. My job is to tell stories that haven't been told. This was news to her. And that's why I don't think it will just change.
To your question about the mainstream media losing its power, I think it lost its power a while ago. And this doesn't just go for CNN and MSNBC. This goes for Fox as well, right? Fox tried to keep Trump from being the nominee in 2016. Really, there was a consensus that he was a clown, and the Fox News machine was unable to gatekeep him. And so, that's just one example of many, but I think the big picture point is that 20 years ago, cable news had an air of authority, which is to say you watched it and many more people than is true today assumed that they were being given something expert, something wise, something. Very few people assume that now. And it's not only reflected in the ratings decline of all of cable news, it's also reflected in the level of trust people accord it, right? It doesn't have that sheen of authority that it used to have when I was a kid.
Does that matter though? Do we need Do we need them to come back? Do we need some sort of reliable, trustworthy news source? What replaces it?
I mean, I think, we saw during the pandemic how, certainly in America, I don't know to what extent it's true in Canada, but just like how deeply people do not trust anything. And that it's a huge problem, especially during a crisis where you have to communicate health to the public.
That's exactly right. I mean, you're completely right that they no longer have the same. CNN does not have the same vantage. They don't have the same certainly place in our imagination that they once did. We took them seriously as objective, and we don't any longer, and that's true. But we also have a real problem that we don't have institutions we can trust, because you see the proliferation of conspiracy theory. And there's a problem because people felt like, I was lied to, therefore any conspiracy theory can be correct. And that's a problem, because it's not true. It doesn't follow just because we were lied to about various things having to do with COVID that any conspiracy theory anyone comes up with could easily be true.
By the way, the last thing on that, I don't know if you caught this moment across the border, but Caitlin Collins was on the late night show with Stephen Colbert, and Colbert said sincerely, not jokingly, I know you guys over there at cable news are objective, and the whole crowd laughed. And they were both stunned. And Caitlin goes, was that supposed to be a laugh line? And he goes, no, but I guess it was. And this was no rabid far right audience. This was the kind of audience curated at the Late Show, right? But they took it as obvious that cable news being objective could only be said in jest, right? Like that was, to me, a big moment to show how far we've come.
There was, so I don't really know who this man is, but maybe you know Scott Jennings. There was this remarkable. Did you see the remarkable
I know him personally.
moment? Okay, on CNN. So he was on CNN on election night, I believe, and he was basically saying, "We got this really wrong. We need to take a good long look at ourselves, and we need to figure out how to understand and to talk to and to listen to the half of the nation that just said we've had enough of this." And there was a whole panel of CNN, I don't know who they were, panelists, and they were just in stunned silence. They couldn't believe that someone was saying it. Do you think that the mainstream media has the ability for that kind of self-reflection, to look at themselves and to look at what they got wrong and to reform?
It's a good question. Sometimes I wonder if everyone in the media is in fact incentivized to do that. Look, if I was an executive at MSNBC, which is the most left-wing of the cable news networks, what would my incentives be? Would I be incentivized to tack to the middle and criticize myself and encourage my anchors to criticize themselves? Or is my business model to go all in on, to Abigail's point, frankly, the religion of people that worship at my church? And regardless of how deeply our philosophy is being refuted by the people who don't watch us and the people who make fun of our clips on social media, maybe my ratings are actually best served not by, when people run for office, they think either I have to turn out my base or I have to reach across the aisle, right? Those are two different strategies to how you win an election. I think a lot of the networks say, I have to increase turnout with my tribe. I don't need to poach people from CNN. I don't need to poach people from Fox News. So I think in some way they might feel they have an incentive to be bad and biased and terrible.
I mean, it's wild to think about how successful they were, given how much agreement there really is in America. See, it's not conservative to believe that people who commit crimes belong in jail, but they presented it that way, or that we need a border, right? There has to be some system for keeping criminals out of the United States or people who don't belong or haven't been allowed in. But they absolutely manufactured this sense that you were on the right if you held those views. Same thing with gender dysphoria and all, the transgender identification and boys and girls sports and a host of other issues. So I guess one way of looking at it is just they were so effective for so long in taking this entirely marginal position and making it seem widespread that even though they've finally been handed a loss, it's hard to sit back and say they're over, because what they accomplished in that time was truly remarkable. They really did divide Americans on issues we are not divided on. And there was the best ad Trump ran by far, and everyone knows it, is Kamala Harris is for they, them. Trump is for you. This ad played 30,000 times. They played it. By far the most effective ad. And Charlemagne the God, I think his name is the African-American podcaster who said about in one of the versions of the ad with the Kamala quote saying she wanted to pay for transgender surgery for prisoners. He said, I don't want my tax dollars going to that. And of course, he was expressing a sentiment held by not a slice of America, nearly all of America. So I suppose it's with some humility that I look at the mainstream media and I think, wow, the propaganda game they were able to play, confusing Americans, pitting them against each other, and for so long was really effective.
Right, that brings us nicely to the gender issue, your book, Irreversible Damage, which, as Brian said, gender is my issue. So it was a wonderful book. It was incredibly well researched, beautifully written. In the last chapter, you say that the institutions that were built to protect young people, such as schools, universities, medical, mental health, they failed in their responsibility to protect those youth when they allowed themselves to be captured by gender identity ideology. So could you explain what you mean by failed, and are you optimistic now with the US election? Are you optimistic that there could be a reversal of that failure?
Yes, I am optimistic. I think there will be a reversal. But here's the thing that I want everyone to know, not without a fight. This is not something like bell bottoms, okay? The number of lies that were piled in order to come up with this gender ideology was astonishing. I have a boy's brain trapped in a girl's body. My gender identity is something only knowable by me, and I'm 8 years old, but I know better than any scientist or my chromosomal, truth. You will have a dead daughter, or you can choose a dead daughter or a live son. Those are your options because we know this is the only way to cure them. All of it was lies. Every part of it. And when you look at it that way, that there was nothing empirical backing up any of this, gender affirmation is the only way, agreeing with a child who thinks they're in the wrong body, that's the way to cure them. We'll reduce suicidality by transitioning young girls. We will eliminate suicide. They will no longer want to kill themselves. It was lie after lie after lie. And here's the thing, they had the burden of proof, not the skeptics, the ones producing and promoting these dangerous, reckless treatments that were irreversible. They bore the burden of proof, and they always put it on the skeptics successfully. So I think that, yes, absolutely, I'm optimistic because the truth has come out. But do I think that's enough to get the ideologues to quit the fight? No, I think they will push it until the last man.
Or woman, Abigail. I don't know if I have anything to add to that. I mean, that was so good.
I have you guys kind of separated at this point, so this is going to be a lot of gender, and then I'll get to you in a moment.
Sure.
Okay. Now, I was just thinking about when irreversible damage. We had the same thing happen in the US, but here in Canada, we had a bunch of trans activists try and get irreversible damage removed from the library shelves. And I live in Ottawa, and at the Ottawa Library, there was a wonderful woman. Her name was Anne Archer. And when they tried to get the book removed, she told them, no, absolutely not. And then there was a wonderful quote. She said, there's something in the library to offend everyone. And I thought that should be above every library door everywhere in the world. But the attempt to censor irreversible damage, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was one of the most vicious attempts in the modern history. Given your experience of that, do you think that we can restore the principles of free speech when talking about something as incendiary as gender ideology?
It depends who cares more. So Anne Archer's a remarkable woman. That didn't take nothing to stand up like that. It took remarkable courage, uncommon courage. And I will just say that I think it was just 2 weeks ago, the World International Bibliography Organization labeled my book with a tag transphobic. So it will now be labeled that way in all libraries. Okay?
Is that like a section of the library? Like African American studies, transphobic?
It's a good question. I don't actually go to it's a good question. But that's what I mean. It really is a Hydra's head. They never stop. They're that intolerant. And when I say they, I of course don't mean transgender people. And I know many, and they're wonderful, and they're lovely. And they are not the activists. And by the way, some of the most egregious activism I've seen, and by an inappropriate and aggressive behavior, whether it's convincing children to keep secrets about their so-called gender identity from their parents, they're not very often, and I've interviewed many, and I've done investigations into this, very often they're not transgender people doing this. So when I say they, I'm not talking about transgender people who are wonderful, by and large. I'm talking about a group of activists who are very crazed and very aggressive and will fight to the last man. And it's really just a question of saying, you're wrong. Having the courage to say, there is no proof. You've presented no proof that puberty blockers will help. And we now have a tremendous amount of proof that they will cause irrevocable harm.
I'll add something to that. I was on CNN last night talking about, we have a Supreme Court case coming up about whether states can ban gender-affirming care for minors, which I think is a pretty reasonable policy. And at minimum, states should get to decide, right? So that's probably going to be the result. And we were talking about it, and there were two trans activists next to me. And at one point they said, well, I think it's great that you have actually trans people at this table talking about this issue as opposed to being talked about all the time. And I responded, well, I do think that's good, but wouldn't you agree it would be much better and necessary to also have a detransitioner at this table, namely someone who transitioned, regretted it, and then had to reverse it with all of the ugly and sometimes unspeakable consequences and side effects that come along with that. And to their credit, they agreed, but I don't think there's going to be a detransitioner on CNN anytime soon. So, I mean, there's also a minority within a minority here that the trans activists are ironically quite eager to whitewash, I find, right? Like they don't want you to think about the phenomenon of detransitioners.
That's right. In fact, part of the reason this is a religion or like a religion is the way they treat apostates. The way they treat detransitioners is unconscionable. They attack them relentlessly in every form of social media that they can, and in person. So the level of ardor and viciousness of some of the activists, it really has to be met with a just refusal to bow to it.
I think I will push back a little bit on something you said, though. I think in gender medicine, certainly because I know a lot about WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, and I think a large part of the problem in gender medicine is that it is being guided by people who are transgender. It's not trans activists on the inside of WPATH. There are plenty of them, actually, but I think there are a lot of people who have made that medical decision for themselves and therefore are invested in it being the right decision for them, and therefore they push for it even for the adolescents and the young people who it very likely is not the right decision. So there is an element of
every radical organization tokenizes one person and puts them in the front and says, this is our speaker for all transgender people. And she says her whole life would have gone better if someone had stopped her puberty, this fantasy, without empirical backing, because nobody can evaluate a counterfactual, right? So yes, in every one of these radical organizations, they will absolutely promote and tokenize the person who they will say represents the whole. But I can't personally say, and this is anecdotal, but having met a great many transgender Americans through interviews, I cannot say that the radicalism, the targeting of children is something that most transgender people want.
Okay.
By the way, on that point, did you notice how quickly Caitlyn Jenner ceased to be the worldwide official spokesman for the trans community, Woman of the Year, the moment she started speaking her mind about various issues relating to biological males in women's sports and not accepting the catechism of trans activists? All of a sudden, you don't hear about her anymore, as if she wasn't the most and first famous trans person in history.
I think he, being a Republican as well, didn't help.
More to the point.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on to bad therapy. I also, there's another, was it published earlier this year? Another wonderful book. Linked to it's the same issue as irreversible damage, but you went much broader, I suppose. It's our pathological obsession with mental health. And I think I've been doing a lot of reading about this recently as well, how psychiatry has just turned the normal responses to human struggles into mental disorders. And so anyone can have a mental disorder at this point. You just take the DSM, you can choose yourself at least one mental disorder. Now, young people, though, as you point out in the book, young people make it their mental disorders, for some reason, a central part of their identity these days. Why do you think that is?
Because we've convinced them that they have a mental disorder, because we've convinced them that they have trauma. And I want you to think about this. The number of books Ibram Kendi has sold and Robin DiAngelo is completely dwarfed by the number of books our trauma salesmen have sold to the American public and the public at large. Millions. Bessel van der Kolk alone has sold millions and millions and millions of books. Okay.
Who is that?
So he is one of the great trauma salesmen among many. And he convinced a generation that they had debilitating trauma. And they convinced their parents, it helped convince their parents that any hardship faced by the child can be traumatizing. And so we raised a generation convinced they couldn't handle any adversity. And lo and behold, they behave as though they cannot. They ask for mental health days off of work. They don't show up for work, right? They claim they have PTSD, 20% of college students. 72, this is a new statistic. This year, 72% of Gen Z women, females, claim that their mental illness is a defining feature of their identity. They believe it's the most salient and important thing about them. So no wonder they aren't ready for adulthood either.
And so why do you think, in your book you say therapy is inducing the mental illness? Would that be right? Or therapy is bad, the title is bad therapy. Why is therapy bad for children?
It's not that therapy is necessarily always bad or that all therapy is bad for children. There are kids who need it, and for them it is good, or it can be. Okay, cognitive behavioral therapy is wonderful at targeting phobias, helping kids get over them. Bedwetting has been treated very effectively with therapy. All kinds of things have. The problem is we are introducing therapy through a therapist. 40% of the rising generation has been in therapy, or through schools, therapy-ish programs like social emotional learning, and through gentle parenting, which is therapeutic parenting. We're undermining kids' resilience and their abilities to handle basic facts of life and basic challenges of life. And the body of research, this is a very old word, iatrogenesis, and I won't run on too long, but iatrogenesis means when the healer introduces harm. It's a very old term. That's why, the Greeks invented it, right? And the idea was that even a good treatment has side effects and can harm if misapplied. And the problem with therapy is not that therapy is all bad or that it's never appropriate. It's that kids are getting way, way, way too much of it when they don't need it. When they have worries, not an anxiety disorder. Sadness, not depression. When they feel uncomfortable when they drive past their middle school because they remember they used to be bullied there. You know what they now call it? PTSD. Oh, I have PTSD. 20% of college students believe they have PTSD. And that's a known harm of therapy, demoralization. It comes from so holding up and elevating your purported disorder that you feel limited by it and trapped in it. Because you can say, I'm shy, but I force myself to perform in public. But if you say I have social phobia, now you need medicine or a treatment. If you say I have anxiety, now you may need medication or ADHD. That's the problem when we start labeling kids. And as adults, we know a lot of successful adults who say, I probably had ADHD. I would have gotten, diagnosed if I were a kid. That's a very common statement by some of our leading CEOs, right? And the truth is, because the reason for that is because once you diagnose a child, they can't ignore it. It's much harder for them to discount. They're not in a position. They haven't lived enough. But an adult CEO or an adult who's successful can say, I was probably inattentive. Now I've learned ways of handling it. And if you even diagnosed an adult, they probably wouldn't take it as seriously as a child will. A child can build an entire world and sense of self around that identity. So you don't hand a child a diagnosis unless you need to.
Yes. I want to talk about your maternal grandmother, but can someone tell me how we're doing for time? I don't have a watch. So I have to pick up the pace. Can we? Okay, but the maternal, because there's a section in the book about your maternal grandmother, and I just love it. If you could just give us a quick, and the lesson that it gives us, I think is wonderful.
Sure, just briefly. So my grandmother was born, I think it was 1927, and her mother died giving birth to her. She was the youngest of 5 kids, and had no mother all of a sudden, and her father was overburdened, and she was passed around by relatives to take care of her. She finally, at age 6, was her eldest sister took her in They were not a rich family by a long shot, right? And everybody helped out, obviously, during those times. But she was living with her sister. She had never known a mother. And then when she was 16, she was living in Washington, D.C. She went with a bunch of girls to the public pool for a swim and came home with polio. And she spent a year in an iron lung. And the reason I tell this story in the book is because every one of us, every person in this room, if you trace your family story, it's a story of suffering, privation, poverty, and loss and hardship. But it's also a story of resilience. And if my grandmother had gone to school today, she would have had an entirely different approach to her. Teachers would have told her she had at least 4 ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, which meant she had suffered trauma. And the expectations for her would have been dialed way down. What she could achieve, what she could overcome. If she handed in a paper late, all would be forgiven. The child psychologists at the school or the school counselor would have interceded on her behalf with teachers to make sure that no one's expected her to do as well or take as many tests as the rest of her classmates. This is how kids are going through school in America today, with low expectations. And because no one told my grandmother that she was permanently damaged, she went on to get married, raise a family. She also eventually went to night school for law school, and she became one of the first judges in Maryland history. And she did all that to a large extent because no one told her there was something fundamentally wrong with her.
Right, Coleman, your turn. Sorry. Okay, in your book, The End of Race Politics, you advocate for a colorblind society. How realistic is that goal in the current political and cultural climate?
Yeah, so I was going to subtitle my book Arguments for a Colorblind Canada, but my publisher thought I should go for the bigger market, so... A colorblind society is, we'll never achieve it, but that's not the point of speaking about it. It's much like speaking about a peaceful society, right? We're never going to get to the point where there are 0 murders, where there's no crazy people that want to assassinate the president or the prime minister, where crime is extinguished, like Minority Report. But no one is deceived no one is deceived enough to think that the peaceful society is not a worthy goal. Everyone agrees we would like to have a society with less violence, so there's no philosophical disagreement. We may disagree over means, how do we get there, but everyone sees that that's a worthy goal, that's the North Star of public policy. Colorblind society should be our North Star when it comes to race and how we think about our race. Now, when I say colorblind, I don't mean pretend not to notice people's race. Like, I'm obviously not an Asian woman and you're obviously not a Hispanic man, right? So don't be naive. Don't pretend not to see. And racism is a real thing. Racial bias is a real thing, right? It's always been out there. It's always going to be out there to some extent. Not every people are going to dislike you sometimes in life for no reason. Okay. So all of that is true, but our North Star should be treat people to the best of your ability without regard to their race and ask your government to do the same, right? That is what I mean by colorblind society. And much like a peaceful society, everyone agrees that's the right goal. I'm trying to get everyone to agree that a colorblind society, and the way I'm using that word, is the right goal.
Lovely. Okay, I'll come to my closing question. Do you have hope that we can one day return to a civil society? Or is it because of our tendency to seek out echo chambers online and consume media that reinforces rather than challenges our beliefs? Are we just doomed to this trench warfare from now on?
I don't know. It's getting trenchier. I mean, half of Twitter left and went to Blue Sky because what's the quote people say? When you're used to privilege, equality seems like oppression, right? So for many years, Twitter was...
That's really good.
Twitter was a left-leaning platform, and that was measurably true. And it censored people who said things as egregious and evil as men are not women, as happened to Meghan Murphy.
That's it.
And you too. There you go. You got the battle scars as well. But obviously, once Elon changed the polarity of it, a lot of liberal elites decided they couldn't tolerate being on the platform, and now there's no, as biased as Twitter was before, it also was the closest thing to a public square that we had. There was tons of conservatives on there too. And if you wanted to be a part of the conversation on either side, you had to be on there, right? And Truth Social did not cannibalize all the conservatives, even remotely, away from Twitter. Not even close. But Blue Sky, really, there's like an exodus it's like some of the top columnists at the New York Times are not on Twitter anymore, right? So we're polarizing and receding more into these political trenches, which I don't see how this could possibly be a good thing for society, because when you get into echo chambers, each side gets more extreme. So I don't know what the solution is, but it's a grim picture, at least as far as social media goes.
Right. Just a little anecdote. Blue Sky it's much, much worse than Twitter in the pre-Elon days. My friend got suspended within 3 minutes of opening her account. No warnings or anything, just shut down. Yeah. Do you have hope, Abigail?
I do have some hope. I mean, here's what I'll say. I talk to a lot of parents because I write on issues that have to do with raising kids and the way kids are growing. And I will tell you that parents are in tremendous agreement. I interview parents all over California, and they sound like what liberals, what the media would call conservatives. This is true of gay couples raising kids, straight couples raising kids, total secularists raising kids. They sound the same on most key issues, the vast majority. They don't want someone else preaching to their kid about something they don't believe and don't think is appropriate for their kid, across the board. So really our ability to withstand or to beat back this fracturing is just about us deciding we're not going to put up with it. And I think to some extent, that's what the election was about. It was some sense of no. Elon Musk is no conservative, or he certainly wasn't one. He just couldn't stomach it anymore. The way he saw the Babylon Bee, I believe, what he couldn't take when they were kicked off Twitter. He said that was the defining moment at some point. And he got involved in maybe I'll just buy it. One guy, one man. And you might say, oh, but he's rich. He can do that because he's, well, a lot of billionaires were pretty quiet. One guy we just had enough. And he gave us back, to a large extent, the public square, as Coleman put it. So I do believe that really there is a tremendous amount of consensus, especially among parents. Those of us raising the next generation. We actually want the future to pretty much look the same. We have the similar vision. It's not necessarily true of people not raising kids. They have a different vision sometimes, some of them. They are less invested in the future. And I think that's a problem. I do. That doesn't mean that, I don't respect everyone's choices when it comes to these things. But I do think that having kids, getting invested in the society, knowing why it matters that the DA of your city actually prosecutes crime and believing it matters because you have little kids running around, that's really important for a society. So if we get back to building families and raising kids, then I do believe that's the greatest hope for our future.
Now, this is my last question. So as we all know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. What message do you have for all the well-meaning people out there, be they parents, teachers, journalists, policymakers, just the general public, who are supporting the harmful ideas and policies that we've talked about today because they think it's the right thing to do? They think it's compassionate and inclusive. What message do you have for them?
I think it's important to look at history and reflect on the fact that most of the evil and terrible movements that killed millions of people were filled with individuals who felt just as morally righteous as you do right now. So from 10,000 feet, you have to examine your own feelings of empathy and passion. Once you feel them, you have to understand that they don't make you right. You have to actually think about, what are the effects of this policy that I am pushing? What is the other side saying? And can I take that in good faith? A lot of people just aren't able to do that. And there are people on both sides, on every side, from every angle, that are unable to do that. But, as Richard Feynman put it, your first job is not to fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So challenge yourself. Don't just talk to your like-minded friends that agree with you about everything. Don't just read the one person that you know is going to tell you what you want. Challenge yourself.
It's a good and difficult question, but I would say, because I think a lot of this has been pushed by people who weren't very well-meaning. But let's talk about your question, which is the people who were well-meaning. And I'll just say this. I say to parents all the time, you can do a lot by starting in your own home. By which I mean, you have a job as parents, right? It's to assert your authority, don't put the kids in charge, and to teach them right from wrong, make them good citizens. We fell down in that big time. The reason I know is because there's broad consensus about policy. Conservatives have been winning on policy, if you ask them about basic policy, for generations. What they've been losing on is other features of the culture. And one of the reasons they've lost is that good people didn't pass on their values to their children. So people didn't know, they would see people tearing down hostage posters and they would think, well, I guess he's really upset about the war in Gaza. Nobody thought, or too few people thought, it's wrong to tear down someone's poster. It doesn't belong to you. That's someone else's child. I don't care what your geopolitical views were. That is wrong. We lost sense of that. Damaging property is wrong. I don't care what you think about this war. You don't get to damage someone else's university. It doesn't belong to you. And I think if we remind good people of that, of just right and wrong, these things become much easier. And I'll give you another example. Doctors say all the time, or they said for years, but I will lose my job, if I speak up. And I would say to them, I am just a journalist. You can speak under your own authority. You know that these puberty blockers are extremely damaging. They are of uncertain benefit. They are no pause button. That was always a lie, and we've known it. They can lead to permanent sexual dysfunction. You know it's wrong to keep silent. It's wrong. And I do think if we remind people of that, we'll go a long way to fixing things.
Thank you, Abigail and Coleman. for a wonderful evening.
Thank you all.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to abuse my position as, to use the term I love to use around the Institute, the dear leader of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. What you've heard tonight is an object lesson. It's a master class, really, in why I started the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. I started the Macdonald-Laurier Institute because ideas are the most powerful force in the world. As Victor Hugo said, plus puissante que toutes les armées du monde, more powerful than all the armies of the world. And why is that? Because ideas are the software on which this human brain operates. And you can either put the right ideas in the human mind, in which case you will get a peaceful, orderly society under the rule of law, or you can let, if you don't fill people's minds with those good ideas, bad ideas will rush in and fill the space. Because nature abhors a vacuum in the human mind just as much as it does in physical nature. And we've been talking tonight about some of the bad ideas that we have allowed to rush in and fill the space in the minds of people in our societies. And I just was making a few notes about what I think some of those bad ideas are. That men can become women simply by wishing it to be so. That 2 + 2 = 4 is racism. And you think I'm making that up. You can find that on lots of websites if you look. Capitalism is unalloyed exploitation. Non-Indigenous Canadians are illegitimate settler colonialist interlopers. We don't belong here. Science is white supremacy, and the search for truth is a vicious illusion. There would be peace in Gaza if only Israel would stop being a genocidal Jewish state. And I could go on and on. We have allowed the institutions by which we traditionally put the good, sound ideas in people's heads to be taken over by people who believe in the bad ideas. And so, the question is, what are we going to do about that? And that brings me back, of course, to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, because if you believe that ideas are the most powerful force in the world, and if you believe that the traditional institutions by which we inculcated those ideas in the minds of the rising generation have been lost to us, then there has to be something to take its place until we can reclaim those institutions. And that's why I created the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, because I believe that the world is full of people who are willing to be the second to say something. And there are very, 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 very few who are willing to be first. And I created the Macdonald-Laurier Institute so that there would be an institution that was always willing to be first to say the things that need to be said so that we can reclaim the society that we always knew and loved here in Canada, in the United States, elsewhere in the Western world, because despite what these people who believe in these bad ideas keep trying to tell us, we are still the greatest hope of the world. But only if we believe in ourselves, right? Ladies and gentlemen, I too would like to ask you to join me in thanking Coleman and Abigail and Mia for such a wonderful conversation this evening. And I hope you will stay and join us for the post-event reception. And I believe that Coleman and Abigail would be happy to meet you and talk a little bit more about some of these ideas after the fact. And again, I will remind you this was an event put on by the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, thanks to the generosity of an anonymous donor. And we hope, if that anonymous donor continues to be so generous that we will be back here next year with another speaker series to delight and entice you. Thank you. Good night.